We now come to the essence of the agreement. We all know the Luxembourg Agreement was a precedent in several respects. It was the first bilateral agreement of the young federal republic. It was the recognition that Israel is the legitimate representative of the murdered and disenfranchised Jews. But at the same time, through the inclusion of the Claims Conference, it was also the recognition of individual suffering. You all know these dimensions in a certain sense. As Konstantin Goschler once put it, Luxembourg stands alongside Nuremberg, just as new standards were formulated in 1948 for dealing with the perpetrators of major state crimes. This also happened in 1952 with regard to dealing with the victims. And in this way, the Luxembourg Agreement can be read as a founding document of new standards of historical justice, whose impact continues to this day. Lorena De Vita will now bring us closer to the local, national, and international significance of what happened there in Wassenaar. And she also, through the university where she works, finally brings to the table of our conference the country that did the work, so to speak, and secured the negotiation side, the Netherlands, and then jokingly spoken, had to watch Luxembourg take all the credit. But that is how life sometimes is. Also with Lorena, I want to reveal a secret about her performance that will make us all envious, at least most of us. Namely, she had the chance, we saw him so impressively in the movie yesterday, to interview Ben Ferenc. Maybe she'll tell us about that too. Either way, she now has the floor.
Thank you very much, Dr. Borchardt. Perfect. Thanks, Adi. So good morning, everyone, and really thanks again to all the organizers, Professor Stauber. Also, thank you for the invitation to present my work in progress to this very distinguished audience. It's really an honor for me to be able to discuss my thinking and also some of the documents I found, some of the interviews I conducted with people, scholars who have also really greatly inspired my interest in the field and in the subject. I have to say, because I'm speaking right after Kai, so it was a great honor also to be at Petersburg, and after having spent a couple of days in the Yad Vashem archives, I cannot but applaud the initiative which is being taken right now. So the work in progress that I'm presenting to you today is part of a broader and ongoing research project on international diplomacy in the aftermath of the Holocaust. This is partially related to my book, which came out in paperback this year. And the book is really a Cold War history of German-German competition in the 1950s and 60s, looked at through the lens of the relations or non-relations that each German state decided to have with Israel in the 50s and 60s. But it's also part of an initiative which I launched earlier this year with the support of the Royal Netherlands Academy for Arts and Sciences in order to contextualize the history of these negotiations as well. So if I had to think of a question to start my presentation and to tell you what I'm going to talk about, then the question would be, when did the negotiations take place? I mean, of course, we all know that. It's in the very title of the conference that we are attending today. It's 70 years ago. But more precisely, my question is, in which kind of context? And in order to answer this question, I want to look at the global political context in which the negotiations took place, but I want to do it from a, let's say, maybe unexpected perspective, namely by looking at the files at the very local level, so including in the Netherlands, indeed, as Dr. Borchardt just said. So the aim of my talk is to contextualize these talks and these negotiations, also by reflecting on some of the tensions that were sometimes having very tangible reverberations at the local level at that time. Because indeed, these negotiations took place in a moment of transition. It was a transition which was, of course, marked by the aftermath of the Holocaust, the Second World War, but also the crumbling of European empires, also raising tensions, both stemming from the Middle East, but also from the global Cold War, which had a very European dimension as well, if one looks at Germany, for example. So just a disclaimer before I properly begin. In the course of my talk, you will hear a lot about The Hague, you might hear about Bonn, East Berlin, even about Cairo, Indonesia. But flipping the perspective in order to look at what was happening outside and around the negotiating table and the signature of the Luxembourg Agreement in no way means to detract from the relevance of the study of the content of those talks, namely this unprecedented and unique process of negotiating compensation, Wiedergutmachung, Shilumim, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And yet, these negotiations did not take place in a vacuum. And keeping this in mind, I think, is important also if we need to grasp the significance of the negotiations. And this is done also by engaging with the contemporary dynamics that characterized international politics at that time. So in order to give you a sense of how I'm going to structure the talk this morning, my presentation will proceed chronologically. I decided to focus on some moments in particular. So I want to start by giving you a sense of what kind of preparations did the Dutch have to go through once they decided to host these talks. Then I want to focus on some incidents that took place in the very first days of negotiations. And then I want to end by reflecting on some of the tensions that were characteristics of the, let's say, aftermath. So after the signing, before the ratification, in that sense. But this chronological structure is also related to a thematic series of points of focus, namely the legacy of Nazism and the Holocaust, and including the Cold War international politics at that time. So in terms of starting with these preparations, indeed, the choice of the Dutch location is interesting. We also heard this yesterday in the documentary. In a sense, from, let's say, a Dutch perspective, the Netherlands was not necessarily the most obvious place to host the talks, also because at that time you have to imagine that the relations between the Netherlands and the Federal Republic of Germany were only just beginning to mend. This is 7 years after the end of the war. At that time, also the relations between the Netherlands and Israel were, let's say, a work in progress. Now, just to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, one of the documents and the reports that the Israeli representative in the Netherlands sent back talked about a sort of two-sided attitude. He reported the fact that in the background, in private talks, Dutch representatives were very supportive of Israel, but that they were very hesitant to take this approach in public. Why? Mostly because they didn't want to alienate the largely Muslim population of Indonesia, also because of the relations that they had with Great Britain at that time. Now, from this Dutch perspective, the Indonesian question matters because the Indonesian recognition, which was for the Dutch, in a sense, also a diplomatic defeat, this took place at the United Nations, and it was especially thanks to the fact that the Arab states had recognized Indonesia first. Now, this was the background. This was the background within which also the Israeli authorities consistently, in any case, kept informed the Dutch authorities about their intention to demand compensation from Germany. So, for example, their 1951 notes, very famous ones in January and March, these were sent both to The Hague, but also to Dutch representations in the Far East for the reasons that I just mentioned. And let's say that despite this background, the Dutch eventually, so first they manifested their interest in the question in general, and eventually a year later they agreed to host the talks. This was in Castel Wassenaar, not too far from where I usually work in the Netherlands. And what is, I think, also interesting to put in the picture is the fact that it was in the same castle. This was originally a villa turned a hotel in the early 1900s. This is where the Reichskommissar for the Netherlands, as Inquart, had stayed in his when he arrived in the Netherlands. So from May to December 1940, this is where he was. And of course, we also know this is also where the negotiations then took place 12 years later with the representatives of the Jewish Claims Conference, Israel, and the Federal Republic of Germany. So eventually, as I mentioned, the Dutch consented to hosting this. This was also related to the fact, despite the fact that extensive security measures would need to be put in place. These kind of security measures were operated on a day-to-day basis by the local police forces, the Gemeentepolitie in The Hague, but also in Wassenaar. But the military police was also involved, the Marechaussee, to monitor the movements of people across the borders, for example, as well as the domestic intelligence services, also in cooperation with the Dutch Foreign Ministry. And just to give you a sense of how the Foreign Ministry and the Dutch diplomats were involved, this is an excerpt from a document from the Dutch representative in Israel. You can see it's the 10th of March, so just 11 days before the beginning of the talks, in which he sends a report including also 3 points. So first, the fact that the negotiations are going to take place in the Netherlands, according to him, is still completely secret. On the other hand, though, the fact that there was certainly very likely going to be efforts on the part of saboteurs to sabotage these talks. And third point, these attempts at sabotage should not be underestimated. And these are the 3 words that were underlined in The Hague, as you can see. So it was also in order to protect the secrecy of these negotiations that newspapers titled along these lines, and this is an example from the Jerusalem Post, so delegations off to Brussels, but this was in fact not true. So they were going to the Netherlands. So indeed, I had the honor and the pleasure to talk with Ben Ferencz about a variety of aspects related to the negotiations, the agreement, and the implementation. And I couldn't help but ask myself, and him actually, how was it to arrive in the Netherlands? How was it? How did he remember it? I will try to play now a very short 2-minute clip of what he told me. So I hope the technology assists me. Of course, we all know him, and I will try to give him the floor.
The first question was, where are we going to have our meetings with the Germans? We all agreed right away, we're not going to go to Germany on this meeting. We have to have a place outside of Germany because people would resent the fact we're going back to Germany in order to negotiate a question like this.
Yeah.
Israel was very hesitant about the whole thing at the time. So we decided that we would keep it secret.
Yes.
And when the time came for me to leave London to go to Holland, I was given an envelope when I left the hotel, said, don't open it until you get in the cab. I got in the cab, I opened it, and it said, proceed to Hoek van Holland, you will be met. And I got on a ship, on a boat, across the canal from London to Holland. And when I got to the other side, they looked at my passport and they looked at me and they said, wait a moment. And then they brought me to a car, and it was a big black Buick, and this is your driver? Okay, I sat in the car and we started going. It was already very early in the morning, maybe 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And we proceeded after about an hour in the car. I said to the driver, where are you taking me? He said, I'm taking you to the meeting place. He didn't tell me. He said, And then as I noticed we were getting closer to houses and places, and we began to slow down, and we pulled in to what looked like a castle. It was Wassenaar.
Yeah.
I didn't know at that time where we were going, but I was greeted at the gate there by what seemed to me to be an SS officer in his black uniform. And I said, I walked into a trap. And then I looked a little more closely, and the SS had a silver stripe running down the side of their black pants. This guard did not have a silver stripe, so I was reassured that it was not SS capturing me.
And of course, as a historian, I just have a short methodological point. I mean, oral history interviews can have their pitfalls, but because, of course, this is a memory a long time ago of someone who is also not so young anymore. But at the same time, I'm very different. But at the same time, this is an important point. I decided to include this anecdote and to include this quote because regardless of I believe this memory, but even if I were to be more cautious on this, anyhow, I think that this anecdote is interesting because it reveals something. It's evocative, I think, of the inner state of at least some of the negotiators approaching that moment and approaching that meeting. That's his own memory of arriving at Wassenaar. And indeed, I think it's an interesting excerpt in order to recall, on the one hand, just how recent the Nazi past was at that time, and indeed, this sense of vulnerability. Now, this is an important point because you might know within the very first days of the beginning of the negotiations, so 21st of March, that's when they started. Only 3 days later, and this is just an example, you know already that the resistance was fierce. It came from Israel, also from the Federal Republic of Germany, elsewhere. But 3 days after the beginning of the talks, Arab League envoy Mohammed Ali Sadiq Bey paid a visit to the West German ambassador in The Hague, even though it was allegedly secret that they were meeting in the Netherlands. He was stressing a link between West German restitutions to the Israeli Holocaust survivors and the claims conference, and also connecting this to calls for Israel to compensate Palestinian refugees of the first Arab-Israeli war. And Bey, in that meeting, informed the German ambassador of the intention to either be partial recipients of any German payments that would be agreed with Israel, or the request to halt the negotiations altogether. Now, throughout 1952, 1953, this kind of requests, even though they were fundamentally unrelated to the question of German restitutions to the survivors and to Israel in the aftermath of the Holocaust, would present themselves regularly for German officials stationed in various parts of the globe. And sometimes these were also reinforced by members of the Federal Diplomatic Service themselves, who we have seen also thanks to the results of the Historical Commission work on their past. Several of them had a connection to the Nazi past as well. But this was not the only, let's say, source of tension among the others that I have mentioned just now. You need to imagine that within 10 days of the beginning of the talks, an envelope arrived at the German embassy in The Hague. It was a light envelope. It was addressed to the German delegation and Dutch police officers, and it's my reason to believe also thanks to the cooperation with the Israeli police, realized that this was in fact an explosive envelope, so they intercepted it in time and it did not explode. This was also in the context of another bomb that had been sent to Konrad Adenauer, addressed to him in Munich, and which indeed had killed the German police officer that was trying to open it a couple of days earlier. Now, but given the fact that this Dutch, let's say, the Dutch envelope had not exploded, it was possible for the police to conduct investigations into how it was manufactured, how it was planned to go off when activated, and how it was composed. So you can see here at the bottom, there is one Dutch newspaper report about this bomb. And then what you see here are some files that I found in the municipality archives in The Hague, because the Dutch tried to get their international contacts activated in order to try and understand who may have sent this, what is this, what are we dealing with, and how can we make sure that we prevent this kind of incidents also in the future. You can see here, this is a letter from the special branch of the Metropolitan Police in London, and essentially explaining here, I'm pointing to the bottom, which was very similar along the lines to letters received by various persons in England in 1947. So within this context of pushing the British out of a mandate Palestine as well. These kind of police efforts, yesterday we heard a very interesting perspective also on the Israeli police here in Israel in January and March 52, but there was also an international dimension to these efforts. And it was also to recognize these efforts that, for example, this is a document in which the Israeli Foreign Minister, Moshe Sharet, also sends his very warm thanks to the Dutch authorities, in which he emphasized the role played by various actors, including the authorities in The Hague, but also the security services, the foreign ministries, and the dozens of officials working day and night. So after difficult months, which were difficult for reasons that had to do, of course, with what was being discussed in the room, but also because of the atmosphere and the tensions outside, we all know the document was signed in silence with the choreography that Professor Dandina explained. And these, of course, took place right after the end of the negotiations in Wassenaar. Now, in terms of the Cold War, this is something that I also want to introduce. The Cold War, when it comes into the picture, it's usually mentioned to explain why West Germany sat at the table and East Germany didn't. So let's say in the beginning of the process. But the Cold War also had an interesting and important role right after the signing of this agreement, because beyond the evident historic significance that the agreement had, it also included a political meaning for the Federal Republic of Germany, which was positioning itself within the Cold War context also as the sole legitimate German state. The year 1952 had witnessed a series of crucial developments for West Germany that really marked an important series of steps forward within the path to relative sovereignty and independence as well. So in a sense, the signing of the Luxembourg Agreement in 1952 also overlapped with the West German gradual progression towards sovereignty. And by signing it, Adenauer's Germany attempted, and I think in a certain extent also managed, to turn the legacy of the Nazi past from a political liability to an element that would emphasize and could emphasize how different his Germany and this Germany was from the one of 1945. So signing the agreement with Israel also reinforced this image of the new Federal Republic, and I think this is important as well. And I think that you can imagine, and this is my last point, then you can understand why for East Germany, the signing of the agreement became a core element of their propaganda against West Germany. This is an example of Neues Deutschland, so the party mouthpiece in East Germany. This was aimed to a domestic audience, but as I trace in the book, throughout the 1950s and 60s, this kind of message was presented also to Arab audiences. Counterintuitively enough, also tried to present it to Israeli audiences at times of particular tension, for example, during the Eichmann trial. This is also, to put it in the broader context, the first major, let's say, diplomatic victory of the German Democratic Republic was an economic agreement signed with Egypt, so the first country outside of the socialist bloc to sign this kind of agreements with the German Democratic Republic, and this happened in February 1953, so shortly after the signing of the agreement, and in a sense also shortly before the ratification thereof in the Bundestag and then in Israel as well. So just to conclude, my point today was that the Wassenaar negotiations and the later signature and ratification of the agreement took place in a context that was characterized by tensions. These were stemming from a variety of points: the bipolar rivalry, the situation in the Middle East, and of course in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the Second World War. The negotiations and the agreement to which they led, of course, would have been groundbreaking and difficult regardless of the exact place, the exact castle in which they would have taken place. But those talks also didn't take place in a vacuum. And I think that keeping this in mind is important and helpful in order to grasp, in retrospect, also the full significance and vulnerability of those negotiations and the agreement that resulted from them. A brief historiographical point: I teach in a course of international relations. I coordinate a master program in international relations in historical perspective. And if I look at the vast majority of international histories of the 20th century, I don't see the Luxembourg Agreement yet. So I am hoping that this kind of meetings, this kind of conferences will also help to bring the relevance of that specific turning point to, let's say, broader audiences within history, but also beyond history. So to raise greater awareness regarding the agreement, including the prehistory, the negotiation, the implementation, but also further ramifications, and to foster a conversation and exchange both among historians, but also across disciplines and different kinds of publics. My very last words: 70 years after those difficult talks, it is high time to remember, reassess, and analyze those negotiations, reflecting on their course, but also their legacy, because they were a fundamental, if fraught, turning point in the history of German, Jewish, Israeli relations, and they marked an event of world historical importance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this. I really have to say, exciting lecture. When I saw the title of your presentation in the beginning, I was wondering how it is possible to put all these dimensions into roughly, let's call it 20 minutes. But you managed to do this. And when I saw this wonderful headline, delegation off to Brussels, I also thought that sometimes, admittedly in very rare occasions, fake news can be justified. But I thought it was also very important what you said in the end, this image of the other Germany. This was also being picked up by Ben-Gurion, actually, who tried to also kind of highlight this picture in order to justify what he is doing here. So in almost every public speech he gave about this, he was kind of highlighting this image of the other Germany, which of course can be disputed with good reasons. So thank you again for this wonderful and very important lecture.